Welcome to the Bayou Progressive. Today we're joined by Nick Albares, a Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate here in Louisiana. Albares is a first-time candidate who most recently served as Vice President of Strategic Development and Public Policy at Volunteers of America Southeast Louisiana, and has also worked in state government during the John Bel Edwards administration. He's running on a message centered around healthcare, affordability, and what he describes as dignity, solutions, and results. Today, we're talking with him not just about the issues, but about who he is, what shaped him, and why he believes he's the right person for this moment. Nick, thank you for joining me.
Quentin, thank you so much for having me. It's really a joy to be with you today.
All right. A lot of Louisiana voters probably during this cycle, this will be the first time that they've heard your name. You're a first-time candidate. Before we get into the issues and what your positions on them are, who are you and why in the world did you decide to run for the U.S. Senate in what they say is ruby red Louisiana?
Yeah. Well, again, Quentin, thanks for having me. I am Nick Alvarez. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, to two parents who were born and raised in New Orleans. And my paternal grandfather's family was from St. Mary Parish. He had moved to New Orleans. And you know, we as a family, when I was young, we actually moved to Alabama, but always stayed really connected to New Orleans and to Louisiana. And when I was in college, I was a sophomore at the University of Notre Dame, and that's when Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast. The levees broke, and we all saw the horrible suffering and the systemic issues that plague New Orleans and really cities all throughout the country. And it spurred me to action, both in service, but then also in justice, because I went and started leading groups down to New Orleans to serve and gut out houses and rebuild houses. But it wasn't just houses that needed to be gutted and rebuilt. It was about policies because, as we know, Katrina was a natural disaster, yes, but also a human-made disaster and a policy failure. And so that led me down the road of digging into policies and figuring out how we could care for people through our public policies. And so I worked with Catholic Charities. When I graduated from Notre Dame, I studied theology for my undergrad. Really focused on social ethics, on focused focusing on, what does the beloved community mean? How do we make that a reality? How do we recognize every person's dignity? And as I went through that, I was coming at it from this values-based perspective. But I wanted to know not just how to express care and concern and social justice and build community. I wanted to see how can we turn organizing into policy change. And so I really wanted to dig into the details of the economics and the policies that are necessary in order to create healthier communities. So I went back to school. I got my master's at Georgetown University in public policy. And, after spending time in Washington, I came back to Louisiana in order to dig back into the issues here. I first worked at the Louisiana Budget Project and then served in Governor Edwards' administration, and then coming back to New Orleans with Volunteers for America. And so my heart has always been focused on service, on building our community. And right now, the next part of my journey is stepping forward in confidence and courage for this United States Senate seat. And you said, well, why would I do this, in Ruby Red, Louisiana? Well, you know, just as we were talking about off air, I mean, this really is an inflection point, I think, for our country. We have a president right now who is, going off about putting an entire civilization off the map, making genocidal claims, really. And what I'm seeing on the Republican side were candidates who their main platform was trying to line up right next to the president. An incumbent who, yes, voted to convict after January 6th, but ever since has worked to cozy up to the president. And then his challengers are trying to out Trump him, by gaining the endorsement, one by touting, his picture with him and trying to talk about how he worked with him. And I think that Louisianans, no matter their political background, want someone who's fighting for them and not just fighting to be closest to Donald Trump. And I think they want a leader that stands on their own 2 feet, who cares about advancing their interests. And, we were able to do that in Edwards' administration. We can talk more about, the specifics of that. But, that's the broad contours of why I got into this race. It's really about the dignity of every person throughout this state in a state that consistently falls at the bottom end of all the measures of well-being, a state where we need leaders who are standing up for our communities, period. So that's why I'm in this race.
Okay. So what makes you think you can win though? And
Yeah.
and I mean it like in the sort of nuts and bolts sort of way. So obviously you have two potential races that you have to think about. And only one in, one foot in front of the other. So the
Yeah.
next race is the most important. What made you think before you filed that you could win a Democratic primary?
Well, I thought that in the Democratic primary, you had, at the time when I qualified, only one other candidate had qualified. And what I saw was that, and when we look at the field right now, none of us have, run statewide before.
Mhm.
Um, and so I felt like there was an opportunity to break through with the message that was based in dignity, based in getting things done, solutions and results, as you talked about my slogan, and I think that I wanted to put myself out there. One of the things that I've realized at certain junctures is, I can't overanalyze a situation, but I need to step forward in confidence and encourage when, I felt the call to do this.
Mhm.
And that's what it was. And so, I think the first step is, as you said, working through this primary. I think that, we've had a great rapport on the campaign trail, the three of us, on the Democratic side, much in contrast to the Republican side, where we have different styles, but shared values. And it's about, trying to build that strength. And I think that primaries do provide an opportunity for us to sharpen our message, to sharpen our campaigns, and to build out our constituencies, and then to come together after that primary in order to work towards the general election victory that we desire. And, as far as the case for victory there, I think you're going to have a situation where you're going to have a lot of division on the Republican side, which really provides an opportunity for us to be the party of unity, the party of dignity, the party of common sense, the party of decency, a party that is ready to repair what has been broken throughout this country. And I think that America and Louisiana are ready for a new generation of leadership. And you see across the country a lot of excitement in states like Texas, in the U.S. Senate,
Yeah.
and and elsewhere. But let's look side by side. Louisiana had a Democratic governor from
Yeah.
2015 to 2023.
Yeah.
Louisiana had a Democratic senator as recently as 2014.
We have had more statewide Democratic success than states that seemingly actually contest every election, like Georgia and Texas.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, I think that it's a matter of breaking through and breaking into the national narrative that will then afford us the opportunity to do what is real significant party building and organizing that's necessary to make that sustainable over the long term. So
But I
that's
guess
why,
I think
yeah.
that's what you just said, though, kind of it opens up a bunch of different questions. So I guess the first one is broadly, why do you think that despite the fact that here in Louisiana we've had more recent statewide Democratic success than places like Texas and Georgia, well, Georgia Georgia's now kind of arrived.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
the next block to fall is the governorship. Um, but we've had recent Democratic success. Heck, of up until recently when I think Biden won Georgia, we were the last southern state to have went Democratic in '96, I believe.
Hmm.
Um, why do you think that in these other states where they're not having the same level of success as recently, but they seem to have more urgency and energy around contesting the narrative that their state is red and that it's not winnable statewide?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it just begins with putting ourselves out there, and so like getting in the race, the first step is like stopping the cycle of self-fulfilling prophecies. Whenever we say it's not winnable, well, then it's not going to be winnable. You can read the book on Governor Edwards, Long Shot, and
Mm-hmm.
see how there were efforts to stymie his run within the Democratic Party itself. And look, these were strategic considerations, but Governor Edwards stepped forward in confidence, and then was able to build something around that. And I think though, what you've seen is we had an era. Let's just talk at the federal level
Mm-hmm.
where you had a number of Democratic senators, going back John Bro and
Yep.
and Mary Landrieu, and you had then the shift over time in the perception of the party and in the makeup of the party, frankly, and I think that there's a difference at the federal and the state level,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. But I think that what it requires us to do now is to take a step back and really invest in that organizing and in doing that work so that it can be more sustainable and not just candidate driven. Like what has happened in Georgia. And
Mm-hmm.
but I think that it starts with candidates who are willing to put in the work, and step forward and then make that a part of their campaign. And then once, I'll say, like, when I get to the U.S. Senate, I would then continue to invest in doing the work of building up the party, and promoting candidates within the state legislature, because I think that we have just a lot of people who are willing and ready to put themselves out there when they have the right support. And I think that we as Democrats have a message that speaks to some shared values and shared priorities. It is not radical for people to want clean air and clean water. It is something that everyone desires to have health care, to be able to go to the doctor and not go bankrupt if they have to have an operation, to be able to send their kids to a good school, to be able to have their kids stay here in Louisiana because there are opportunities, and there are good jobs. And so, all of these things are things that Democrats we're fighting for. And I think that, we need to just continue to focus in on those values and those priorities. And I think that we can bring people over to our side. And my strategy here in a general election is really going to be going into communities and listening. With my background in nonprofits, and that's a lot of what we do is we go and we assess the needs that exist in a community. We listen to the community, and then we figure out how we can solve problems collaboratively. And that's what, I'm about. And I think that, if we can just really be solutions focused, then people are going to be open to that message.
You led me in like three different directions, and now I'm trying to decide
Whoa,
which one I want to
which way
go in.
on? Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, let's see if we can maybe make a clip here. You said that the perception of the Democratic Party may have had a role in the current state of the party. How would you, especially in the last couple of months after campaigning, what would you say is the perception of the Democratic Party right now to the average voter?
Well, I think it certainly depends on who you're talking to. I think that the thing about Democrats, we people look to the Congress, people look to the presidential campaigns that we've had, and it's I think that we are in a place where we have an opportunity to shape what that looks like,
Mhm.
frankly, because I think that the Republican side is trying to push this narrative that Democrats are out of touch, right? And that are they're focused on, their coastal elites and that type of thing. And I think that we counter that simply by being present and by showing that no, we're the party that is in touch with what's really affecting people and affecting people's lives. We're in touch with the cost of living crisis. We're in touch with the cuts that are happening to healthcare. We're in touch with rising gas prices because of these foreign wars of choice. And so I think that we have an opportunity when we listen. And I found on the campaign trail that we've been able to talk to people who were even they'll say, I was a Trump voter, and when they hear Democrat, at first, the thing is, oh, but I just keep talking to them, and keep saying like, look, I'm running for the people, and people means everyone, and just keep talking about the specific issues that I'm going to fight for, and then also to talk about decency, dignity, accountability for government. These are things that every person should want. And I think that there is a feeling that, Washington is leading us into more chaos. Washington is leading us into more corruption and cruelty. And so I think that we do have an opportunity to shape what the next generation perceives as what the Democratic Party is fighting for.
Have there been any presumptions that, especially like when you're talking to a Trump voter, where they have a presumption about what you might believe because you say you're a Democrat that you've had to rebut?
That's an interesting question. I think it's really one thing where people, maybe they just think that I'm not connected to them in some way because I'm a Democrat. It's like a cultural thing. But having to just push through that, and like I said, you just keep talking about the issues. And maybe there are things where we're not going to align, where I'm not going to let go of my values on, let's say the dignity of every person and equal rights under the law for our LGBTQ neighbors. And that's something that I'm not going to let go of. But, I think that I can keep talking to people and say, look, this is about human dignity. This is about equal justice under the law. This is about decency and non-discrimination. And, we shouldn't be using people as, people as political pawns. And so I think that that resonates, or at least it creates a connection point. And for me, it's about just pushing through any discussion, not getting defensive, not and again, not backing down from my values, but just being present and being able to listen and to engage. I do have this acronym that I like to use. That's my leadership acronym, and it's LEAD, LEAD, and it's listen, engage, act, deliver. And so, I start by listening. I engage with that information, bring my values into that situation as well, but then act upon it. Try to move towards solutions and then deliver. So,
You could argue that that honestly is just the job description of a congressperson, but
absolutely, yeah,
we've got
absolutely. That's the job.
we've gotten very tribal though. I
Yeah.
remember I always think that this is kind of controversial, but there, before we got rid of earmarks, w- one of the arguments for earmarks was that it made almost every congressperson to some degree practical. And the example I always use is that, back in the day, Ron Paul, who at this point now I'm starting to date myself because most people probably just know his son Rand Paul, but Ron Paul was the
Right.
libertarian out in Texas, and he'd vote against almost everything the Republicans would put up. But when it came time for those tight votes where the margins were razor thin, they go up to Ron Paul and say, Dr. Paul, that research center that you wanted in Houston, here's $1 million, and Ron Paul would vote the right way. And that, among a lot of things that have contributed to it, I think that in getting rid of that in pursuit of sort of purity, what it's also done is it's made Congress much more tribal because no longer are people prioritizing, the quote unquote bringing home the bacon. Now, because, that's uncouth, you're just going there to make a point. You're going there to make political points, and you don't have to really deliver. And so that's what I like about that acronym, is that it kind of goes back to the idea of, at the end of the day, your job is to your constituents, and you have to. You can't go back to your constituents and say I own the libs. Like that's not delivery. That's not policy. That
Right.
doesn't help anybody.
Right. That's right. And look, there's a lot that's contributing to the division. Uh, we can talk about the silos of our media environment and how that contributes to things and just political communications, how they work to inflame the extreme. And I think that the president right now is the personification of that. And I think though that there has to be a tipping point. Like I said, there's an inflection point where people want ultimately to be in a stable environment where we can get along. And there's a lot of scapegoating that happens in politics, and I think the way around that is by our leaders actually showing up to lead. A leader does listen, but then a leader does act. And that's the thing with that acronym is that I'm going to listen, but I'm not going to just be a follower. And so many of our so-called leaders are really just trying to appeal to people by taking advantage of or exploiting divisions, which right now are oftentimes driven by social media algorithms that billionaires are putting in place in order to drive engagement and keep people hooked on social media or whatever content it may be in order to drive that division. And I think that by coming together and by putting forward a message that is values driven and that is focused on unity, we can move forward because I think people are hungering for that. I don't know if you've seen any of the coverage of the astronauts, up in the
Mm-hmm.
Artemis mission, and there was an interview with them, and one of the astronauts talked about how looking back at Earth, it really put everything into perspective because it was just this unity of this one Earth,
Yep.
and all the wars, all the division, everything was happening down there, but you couldn't perceive that. All you saw was the unity. And that really broke through and resonated with people in a profound way. And I think there's just a hunger for a level of healing within our politics that is necessary. And it's about just again recognizing that every person has inherent worth. Every person has dignity, and we shouldn't excuse bad behavior or bad policies. We need to stand against those. And so it's not about just saying, "Oh, well, anything goes." No, it's about standing for our values, but it's about recognizing that too often people with power are driving divisions and exploiting divisions in order to maintain power and control. And we need more leaders that are going to step up against them.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit to your not so much your platform, but in general, your positions on issues. So I'll give you kind of the basic stuff. Are you what is your position on abortion? standard fare
Yeah.
stuff for Louisiana. So, are you
Yeah.
pro-life? Are you pro-choice? How would you describe yourself?
So I don't think that politicians should be involved in personal medical decisions. And that's period. Period. Politicians should not be involved in personal
So, like
medical decisions.
full libertarian, assisted suicide, all that.
Well, look, I think that we have to set forward. We have to create a system that allows for people to make choices about their own body.
Hmm.
And what that means for me, in terms of the abortion issue, when I look at the bans that have been put in place and the way that that has impacted women who are trying to get emergency care when they're having a miscarriage and not able to get that care because the provider is afraid that they would be prosecuted because of these abortion bans, that's just unacceptable. And so we need a regulatory environment that is going to ensure that women are protected and that they're safe, and they're able to make these medical decisions privately with counsel of any faith leader if they choose, and certainly with their physician. And we need to make sure that, in my view, we need to do more to protect women who are struggling with pregnancies. If we really want to develop a system that supports women who are pregnant, let's focus on ways that we can take care of those that are looking to see pregnancies to term. Because right now, here in Louisiana, we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. And for Black women, it's 4 times the rate of white women. And so I think that's where our focus should be, frankly, not in legislating personal medical decisions as it relates to reproductive rights.
So, I think a few years ago, that I think that probably would have sufficed in terms of the Democratic position, but obviously Roe was overturned. And so there is the need for legislative action, obviously
Yeah.
on the part of those that want to protect
Right.
a woman's right to choose. So how far would you go in terms of that legislative protection? Would you go as far as a constitutional amendment to protect a woman's right to choose?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Those should be personal decisions. So women should be able to be trusted to make those decisions again with their physician, and faith leader if they so choose. But those are personal medical decisions.
Okay, and here we go. I'm gonna walk through the hot coals of controversy here, or at
Yeah.
least for Louisiana.
Yeah.
Um, this is an oil and gas state. This is a
Yeah.
state in which the petrochemical industry pretty much has its way with our state government, local government. I just noted on social media that Exxon is the chief sponsor of Earth Day here in Baton Rouge. Um, what are your views on climate change broadly? Do you believe that climate change is real? But also, to kind of not give you such a softball, how do you balance in environmental responsibilities and the awareness of science with the reality of the state that you'd be representing, the reality that the petrochemical industry is one of the largest employers in the state that you'd represent. It's one of the biggest economic drivers in the state that you'd be representing. How do you balance the practicality of that?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, Quentin. And I think that first to answer the first part of your question, yes, absolutely. We should trust our scientists who are sharing what's going on with our climate and the fact that we, as a global community, need to reduce our emissions in order to put the Earth on a sustainable path moving forward. I worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality when I was in graduate school during the Obama administration. And these were issues that we worked on. We put in place a clean power plan. I worked to reduce hydrofluorocarbon emissions. And so, to the second part of your question around Louisiana, we still require a full suite of energy, in this country. We're still unfortunately dependent on oil and gas for much of our energy needs. And so, as a state for Louisiana, we do need to support jobs, and we need to make sure that industry works in a way that is responsible, that respects the environment, and that if there are ever, you know, mishaps, we saw the tragic BP oil disaster, and during that time, I was working with Catholic Charities, and we did a whole lot of work with the oystermen, in order to provide relief, in order to provide support for those communities. And so, we've seen here in Louisiana how there is danger, but there's also, like you said, a lot of jobs. And I think, moving forward, the path is to continue to invest in our clean energy solutions, because we have a lot of energy infrastructure here in Louisiana that can be utilized for emerging technologies, for wind, for solar. And I think that's where we should put our focus, because, unfortunately, what we're seeing is administration to administration, a shift in priorities. I think Louisiana would benefit from stability and certainty, stability and certainty, so that we can build the infrastructure necessary to invest in these technologies of the future. Because we know that in order to get to the place that we need to be, we have to invest in new technologies, and we have to be at the cutting edge of clean and green technologies. And so, that's where my focus will be in the U.S. Senate, is putting us on a responsible path towards creating more jobs in those sectors. Because I think, again, we have a lot of opportunity with our experience in the energy sector. And I think that as we continue to work to reduce emissions, we can do so in a way that is a smooth transition for the state of Louisiana.
How would you describe yourself as a Democrat? If I guess I guess I'm part of the media right now, so if a media member had to put you in a box, um, or even maybe if the question was maybe placed like, what is your lane in the
Hmm.
Democratic Party? Would you say that you
Sure.
are progressive? Would you say that you are conservative, moderate? How would you characterize yourself on that spectrum?
Yeah. Well, I would say that I'm a dignity Democrat. I believe in the dignity of every person, and that's where our policy ought to start. And we should have programs and policies that support that dignity. And, so you talked about a spectrum. I mean, when we talk about progressive, I want progress. I want to raise the minimum wage substantially. I want every family to be able to have access to free early care and education, to paid family and sick leave. And I think we can do those things when we demand that billionaires pay their fair share in taxes. And I want to end corruption in DC. I want to reverse Citizens United so that we can have elections that aren't drowned in corporate PAC dollars. And so, I want progress. When we say progressive, we're talking about progress. We want progress as a society, as a people. Um, when we say conservative, that references conserving. A lot of times people talk about what's happened in the past, the way that we've done things in the past, and I think that from that perspective, I believe in values, and that we should look to our faith communities and our institutions that are community pillars, and that we should strengthen those that are contributing to the fabric of the community. And so in that respect, I think that we should conserve what is feeding our communities. and we should move away from things that are destroying or holding our communities back. And I don't think I don't identify in terms of thinking about moderation because I think that we have to step forward and certainly like I will say I'm ready to work with everyone because it's about being solutions oriented, but we don't water down our values, but we stay open to working with people of all different belief sets so that we can actually pursue solutions that impact people. And so, that's what I would say is that, I go back to my motto, I'm a dignity Democrat who believes in being solution oriented. And so, that's what I'm going to keep pushing for. And so, I was talking to a group the other day and we were talking about a good example is healthcare. I believe that everyone should have access to healthcare that's free of charge and where everyone gets a card in the mail that says they have health coverage here in the richest country in the world. And I'm
So
going to
single payer?
yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that we should absolutely work towards. And, at the same time, I'm going to fight to reverse the $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts that we have.
Yeah.
And I'm also going to work to preserve and protect the coverage that people have right now and strengthen it. So it's putting out like this is the ideal that we want and then here's where we are, and we're going to work steadily towards that. And so, I guess in that sense, I describe myself as pragmatic and again, solutions focused. I'm not going to lose sight of the vision and the values, but I'm going to work steadily to, like at the outset, we need to reverse the cuts that have happened to Medicaid. There's $1 trillion in cuts that are set to go in place on January 1st, 2027. They put them after the midterms so that we wouldn't know about them or people wouldn't be upset about those until, after the midterm election. So, I'm reminding people healthcare is on the ballot.
Yeah.
But then, once we do that, there's so much more that's necessary. But it's constantly looking at, what can we do? What are we able to accomplish given the circumstances and pushing as far as we can.
Why do you think Republicans are so comfortable embracing the conservative mantle? There's not a single Republican that would say that they're not conservative, right? And all of them are trying to prove to some degree that they are, either the most conservative or the most solidly conservative, that sort of thing, that there's a fidelity to a certain ideology. Why do you think it's easier for Republicans to openly sort of embrace that kind of ideological label than it is for Democrats?
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess it depends on, I don't like to get into labels too much,
Mm-hmm.
because uh, people have different definitions for labels, I'm very comfortable saying that I'm progressive from the perspective of I'm going to push for progress. Like I said, I'm
Yeah.
going to push for, setting forth a vision of what we want to accomplish and then working steadily towards that. At the same time, when we talk about conservatism, thinking about what are people, looking to conserve or what are those things that, that kind of brings up. And I think that, when you think about it, it really comes down to a bit of identity because the Republican Party, right now, I don't think there's anything, there's a lot of it that is not conservative. You look at the big, beautiful bill, that was certainly not fiscally conservative. That,
Mm-hmm.
threw tax breaks to billionaires, and cut Medicaid. I don't think that's conservative. That added to the deficit. So you've seen these different eras of, republicanism
Mm-hmm.
all cloaked in quote unquote conservatism. But, you had the president talk about, being conservative as it relates to national foreign policy, not getting into new wars, being quote unquote America first, but then completely reversing that. And so I think that, as Democrats, one of the things that we sometimes can struggle with is, we want to explain it all, right? And we don't want to make complex things oversimplified, because I think that we believe in integrity. We don't want to just like put a label on something and say, we're that, and then just put everything under the sun under that label. We want to be specific about our policy prescriptions and how we're going to do things.
Sometimes to a
And
fault.
yeah, no, and that's what I was going to say. Sometimes to a fault, and one of my favorite quotes, it goes something like this. It says that, I wouldn't give a fig for simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give everything for simplicity on the other side of complexity. And I think that that's, our challenge is that we have to put things in simple terms, but that take into account that complexity. And so for me, what that means is talking about shared Louisiana values, shared
Hmm.
priorities. The fact that every person wants to walk out of their home onto a safe street. Everyone wants to have health care and not go bankrupt if they have to have an operation. Everyone wants to send their kids to good schools with highly trained and well compensated teachers. Everyone wants to be able to have a good job that pays a fair wage. And
Hmm.
so I think it's about getting back to that simplicity. And everyone wants to be treated with respect and dignity, right? And and I think that people want to live in community where they're able to work through and get through issues that arise, in a manner that is about building something that's positive and that's reflective of our values. And so I think that as Democrats, when we can express those progressive. There's someone at the Tulane Book Festival I saw, had a shirt that said something of that nature, like I'm a radical, or, I believe in these radical things, like clean air, clean water, healthcare, education. It's like these shouldn't be radical. These are the things that everyone desires. And I think, as Democrats, we don't need to overcomplicate it. And that's where the simplicity is on the other side of complexity. It's these are the things, and let's not get caught up in labels, but these are the things that we're fighting for every single person.
It is when you put it like that, it is wild that the things that we're fighting for on paper should sell themselves,
That's right.
right? And yet we struggle with it. And not only do we struggle with it, we've allowed the other side to somehow, brand those things as crazy, as extreme, and taking things away from people and, mistreating people has become the mainstream of their party. And say what you will about the moral the morality of their ideology, the effectiveness of their branding, I think, is what kind of has defined the battle between Democrats and Republicans, at least of my lifetime. The fact that they do sort of what you're saying. They are good at the bumper sticker. They're good at making everything less than a few syllables. And
Mm,
we sometimes struggle because we're like, well, let me show you the 10-point plan here. And there's a
right.
certain practicality to how you have to meet people where they are. And I think that kind of leads me to my next question. What, as you're campaigning and you're talking to, because this is a state that Donald Trump won pretty handily, and if it wasn't, if they're not a Trump voter, they are somebody who's been disenchanted and probably haven't voted in a while, um, because of our low turnout numbers. What what do you believe the average Trump voter believes? What do they care about? Like why did they vote for Trump? What do they think they were getting?
Yeah. You know, I've got a couple thoughts on that. In 2024, I did a lot of phone banking for Vice President Harris and called into swing states. And I thought we were going to be focused on GOTV, getting out the vote. But I was actually talking to a lot of people who were legitimately on the fence. And here are some of the things that I heard, of why people were considering and or ultimately had decided to vote for Donald Trump. One of the things that you learn in politics is sometimes some people don't want to think about politics at all, right? And they are living their life into whatever it is they're into. And so when they're going to vote, they are focused on associations. And this association of Donald Trump as a businessman is one that has just been hard to, push back on. Especially when he was running for election this past go round. That was one thing that I heard was, oh, well, um, the inflation and everything that's going on, the president will come in and fix this. And look, I think you see that that doesn't have staying power when the results don't reflect that. You see the president's poll numbers right now. I think it was a situation where people, he got in the first time. Um, he totally mishandled the COVID crisis, and that was a big reason why he lost, I think. And but then, we got past COVID, and inflation was a major issue, and you saw incumbents around the world that were losing. And so this frame of, a supposed businessman. And the other thing that I'll say to that is I think there's this strongman personality, where people in a real twisted way feel seen and heard by Donald Trump. And I think the antidote, in my opinion, to that is authentically hearing people and seeing them and and being in touch. That's something that we heard a lot was, Democrats are out of touch with people. And I think, this is central to my campaign, is it's taking the policy knowledge and expertise that we have, but also bringing a real human connection to it. And that's how I try to blend, my experiences is I have the policy background. I could write you the 10-point plan, but at the same time, it requires going into communities and meeting people where they're at, and coming in and listening. And just like we just talked about with these shared Louisiana values and priorities, talking about those, listening to people, and not sacrificing or watering down values in any way, but just being there and setting ourselves forward as people who are standing for dignity, and that's everyone's dignity. And I think that's how we can break through. And look, that's how Governor Edwards was able to break through in large part. When we were running for reelection in 2019, I worked on the policy platform for the reelection campaign, and we were focused on family values. The family values of equal pay for equal work, for raising the minimum wage, for childcare assistance. All of these policies that really impact people's lives. And where on the other side there was resistance to that, but it was also just uh, relating to people in a real human way. And so I think that's what it takes, and it takes, I think, strength to not just walk away when there's conflict. When even the first reaction is, oh, you're a Democrat, not conversation over. Say no, I want to engage here. But look, so much of it too, I got to say, along with this, yes, we do need to engage every single person. At the same time, I think in order to gain the power, we also need to focus, on Democrats, and not just trying to bring people over from the Republican side. I guess that's got to be part of it, but it's giving people who are Democrats or no party, hope, providing inspiration that change is possible, and talking about what we have done when we've been able to gain power, reminding people that when we in 2008 when President Obama was in office and we had the Senate and we had the House, we were able to pass the Affordable Care Act. And we know there was this huge pushback. But now it's
Yeah.
something, we look at Medicaid expansion, and that was something that we put in place in 2015. It was a campaign issue in 2019 for Governor Edwards, where Eddie Risponi wanted to freeze Medicaid. We went
Hmm.
we went around the state, reminding people or educating people on what that would mean. I think that was a central part of that election. And then, when Jeff Landry came into office, he did not try to take away the Medicaid expansion. It was firmly part of our system. And sometimes it takes that courage to be able to see something through over the course of many years to really make policy change. And we need so much more in terms of strengthening healthcare. But I really look, I want to invite Republicans to the table to say, look, let's get back to a place where we can really be focused on pursuing policies that benefit our communities. And let's I long for the day when we can have like true policy debates and discussions and collaboration where we're bringing our ideas forward to advance our communities and not just stuck in the cycle where we're just not able to get things done, or we're constantly fighting uh, people who are trying to push the billionaire class. That's the thing. We look at this big beautiful bill, so called, and it's tax cuts for billionaires and to cut Medicaid, and we just need to get beyond that where we can try to be on the same page where we're trying to pursue these shared values and priorities.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue to my favorite question that I ask everybody, which is in 2026, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican? Because if you're going to get on the same page, part of it is recognizing where there's shared alignment, where there's some shared goals, even if it's not shared strategy to get there. What is the difference between a Democrat and Republican in 2026?
Well, in my perspective, I'll bring it back to dignity. I think as Democrats, we are pursuing policies that reflect the reality that every single person has dignity. And I think right now, what you see on the Republican side are politicians who are trying to line up next to the president, who right now is plunging the country into further chaos. And so I want to get us away from the politics of personality, and back to the politics of people, and what people actually need in our communities. So again, it goes back to those shared Louisiana values, shared American, human values, making sure that people have a safe place to live, housing that's affordable, good schools, good jobs, healthcare, all of these things that we should agree upon, and making sure that those are available to every single person, and not just the few, not just the billionaire class. Um, the government should not be rigged in such a way that it just enriches people further. It should not be a tool of business. It should be a means to create opportunity, and so that all people can reach their highest potential. Because I think that our society is strongest when every person is reaching their highest potential, when people are able to start businesses, start small businesses, when people are able to pursue their dreams, their educational goals, whatever it might be. Like that's where we're strongest. And I think that we can do it when we come together and when we have leaders who are focused on that.
What is your favorite policy to talk about on the campaign trail, even if it's not like the like your pillar, the pillars of your platform, even if it's not the most popular, what is your favorite policy to just like talk about, break down, to share with people? If it didn't matter if it was popular or not, what's your favorite one so far to talk about?
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about healthcare, and I think that would be my favorite to talk about because when we talk about healthcare, it's not just about going to the doctor. Health, in my view, is a holistic perspective. Health entails all of our social drivers of health. It's, are you able to get to work? Are you able to have a good solid job? Are you able to do, your mental health? And then, I was on a podcast earlier today. We talked about this. We were talking about healthcare.
You're doing the circuit.
Yeah, yeah. You know, healthcare and then also societal health. I think that's what we've been talking about a little bit, today as well. Is how is our healthcare system from a policy perspective, but then how is our societal health? And I see a connection there because everyone should be able to access the basics of being able to go to the doctor. People should be able to access get an operation if they need to, get in the preventive care that's necessary. But then we also should talk about, how healthy are our communities? How healthy are our cities, our towns, our rural areas from a place of, community institutions, from a place of opportunity, from a place of jobs. So I think both of those working in tandem. I mean, it encompasses a lot, when we really talk about policy. But in public health, we talk about those as social drivers of health or health related social needs that people have, and it really gets at the question of what is the health of our cities, what's the health of our communities, and ultimately our society, our nation. So. I think, those are the things that I like to talk about with folks.
And I guess the reason I ask is because as a policy guy, as somebody that was helping shape the policy platform of the Edwards campaign, you've always, and I kind of compare it to like a showrunner with a writer's room. You've always kind of been responsible for taking somebody else's vision and figuring out how to put meat on the bones. But now you're driving the train, and it's your vision. So have you had an opportunity? And I get it because like campaigns are very utilitarian. There's not a lot of time to kind of indulge, but have you had an opportunity to kind of explore policy and the creativity that you can have with policy proposals, being the front man of your campaign, being the person that has to sell these ideas? It's your ideas. Have you sort of gotten a chance to kind of enjoy being able to set out a vision and not necessarily having to fill out somebody else's?
Yeah, I think certainly there's an aspect of, being able to put forward, my ideas, my vision. At the same time, as we talk about where we're at as a country, with an inflection point, so much of our challenge right now is being, as a United States Senator, so much of my job would be being a check on the executive branch right now. And it feels like, that's just really necessary, especially what's going on in Iran. I mean, we need a Congress that's ready to stand up to what's going on. And that just feels really immediate, really dire. And I tell people this all the time. Look, I don't want the country to go downhill right now for any type of personal political gain or political gain across the board. I want what's best for our country, but we need people who are ready to step up and fight against what is a really dangerous situation. And so that maybe takes the luster a little bit off of, the excitement of putting together and putting forward, my policy vision. But look, we're going to continue to push and we're going to continue to roll out what we think is a proactive vision that can gain bipartisan support, and that is about these shared Louisiana values and priorities.
Would you vote to authorize further? Would you vote for war authorization for the war in Iran?
No, no. This is a ridiculous, reckless, impulsive war of choice. The president has not laid out any type of goals, objectives, or off-ramp for this war. 8 months ago, and 9 months ago now, the president said that the Iranian nuclear capabilities had been, quote, obliterated. And so here we are in this quagmire where the Strait of Hormuz is closed, which has drastic implications for the global economy. And the president is now making ridiculous, outrageous, inappropriate. There aren't even words to describe how dangerous what the president is doing right now is, and so we need to reverse course as quickly as possible. And
And for the record, just so for listeners who are not news junkies like we are, but I guess I don't know if how you could have avoided this. The president earlier today said that he would take out the entire country of Iran by tonight if the Strait of Hormuz was not opened. I believe he said, "Open the fucking strait," if I'm not mistaken,
yeah, he
in a
actually
rant.
that rant was on Easter Sunday, and
Easter Sunday. Yeah, the rant was on Easter Sunday. This morning he doubled down and said that by 8 p.m., if I'm
right,
not mistaken,
that's right.
if they had not opened up the Strait of Hormuz, he would take out the entire country of Iran, which obviously implies quite a few war crimes in
Yeah,
all of that.
yeah. And so it's really just out of bounds, completely inappropriate, completely out of line, which unfortunately has been the pattern from this administration. But we need senators of both parties. We need members of Congress of both parties to step up against this. And when you say what's the difference of between Republicans and Democrats, and I think that Democrats are not ones to just allow for this type of behavior amongst leaders. And I can certainly make the pledge that no matter who the president is, no matter which party the president is, if it's my party or not, I'm going to stand on my values, and I would not stand for that behavior, whether it was coming from someone of my own party or the other party.
So just a couple more questions, and then I will let you go. I don't know if you're
Yeah.
going to be doing any activities in New Orleans this week, but I know I have to make that drive down soon.
Yeah, I'll
Um,
probably see you around there. Yeah.
yeah. I picked one heck of a year to stop drinking because I could certainly use one this week. Um, so you're running in a Democratic primary here in Louisiana, and in any Democratic primary, in any Democrat anywhere, the base of their party, part of the base of their party is the black vote. But in Louisiana, obviously, we have a very long history of racial politics, both broadly, but especially in the Democratic Party. And to be transparent with everybody, you and I had a conversation very early in the campaign, and I told you that there is a lane that exists always in statewide Louisiana politics of the sort of moderate white guy that can kind of come in, but there's also a risk there is that now you also have to consistently justify to the base of the party that you're going to count on that has to come out for any Democrat to win. You have to be able to assure them that you're going to fight for their interests. That, sometimes it gets very simple here in Louisiana, which is that if you're black, you'll fight for black folks. And if you're not, then you probably won't. And I'm sure that you've seen sometimes where local municipal votes, instead of them even reporting the Democratic versus Republican vote count, they'll just, they'll report five white votes, four black votes, or something like that. Like that's how rudimentary it can get here. If you were the nominee, and obviously you would depend heavily on the black vote to turn out in November. What have you learned about the black community and, in particular, the black community's political interests in Louisiana that have one informed your campaign and your candidacy, but that you'd also take with you into the Senate? And how can you assure black folks in Louisiana that if you are at the top of the ticket, that just because you're a white guy doesn't mean that you're not going to fight like somebody who's representing one of the largest black populations in the country?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the thing that I've learned, or that I know, is that the black experience in Louisiana has been one that's forged in struggle, the struggle for equal rights, for civil rights, for voting rights. That's of course based in subjugation and discrimination initially, and that has been a decades and centuries long struggle, and that continues to today. I think about the conversations that I have with Dr. Leona Tate, who was one of the three girls that integrated the New Orleans school system, or four girls, including Ruby Bridges. Um, but they integrated the three girls, Dr. Tate, Miss Etienne, and Miss Prevost, another school where it was a different situation because all the white children left that school completely. And it was the three of them that received classes in that school. They've turned that in, Dr. Tate's turned that into a community center. But, I think about Dr. Tate and the fact that, she is someone that, I have conversations with, but it just reminds us that this is extremely recent history in terms of the struggle for civil rights and voting rights, and that we just need to look at the data to show us that uh, inequality exists still in healthcare, in education, in housing, in poverty. And so I guess my first thing is to share that, I'm aware of the realities, and that I'm someone who is committed to fighting for equal rights, for civil rights, for voting rights, and that my work is shaped by many mentors along the way. I think about folks like Ronnie Moore, who I worked with at Catholic Charities, who was a civil rights activist. Uh, I think about my president and CEO at Volunteers of America, Boris Vigi. I think about a lot of Black leaders who encouraged me to actually get into this race and to run and put myself forward for public service. And I think that I take that with me, and I take special care to remember the responsibility that I have, based on my background, to stand in solidarity with Black communities throughout the state of Louisiana, and I don't take that lightly.
If you lose this race, what do you think you'll have learned about yourself?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have a saying that I use that says, you win or you learn. Ideally, you win and you learn, but you win or you learn. And so, from every experience, from every angle, I'm constantly trying to learn. And the first thing that I learned, stepping forward, I've been using the phrase of stepping forward in confidence and in courage. And I've learned, and I encourage everyone else to know that you can step forward in confidence, whether it's something that you've been thinking about going back to school or starting a business, or whether it's a relationship, whatever the case may be, we have agency. And the key, I think, is to remain true to yourself, to bring your authentic self. And that's been something that, I've really tried to focus on here in the campaign because, in the campaign, you can get pulled in a lot of different directions. But it's about staying true to self and staying true to the mission, which for me, the mission has always been about serving the community, about building community. And so we said when we started this campaign that everywhere we go, we're going to work to build community.
Mhm.
My wife's an artist. She did this painting behind me that says, sprinkle love like it's confetti. And, you're going to hear me more and more
Hmm.
on the campaign trail just using the word love because, I think, uh, especially just having gone through some tough times recently, personally, I don't want to hold that back. And my policy work is really about creating the beloved community, creating a community of love. And love is not soft. I think there's strength in that that we need to continue to push forward. And it's not to make light of or minimize the struggle that exists. There is a struggle that we need to take part in, um, but it's about at every step of the journey connecting people, connecting ideas, and connecting communities so that we can advance together. Because I think that just looking big picture at the country as a whole, again, I think we're at an inflection point, and it can go one of two ways. The founders of the country, had a saying that we can either hang together or hang separately, and that was like very real at that time. But I think the idea of that is like, look, we're in this together. We're on this planet, like the astronauts saw, all together. And we need leaders who are doing the work to make sure that every single person's dignity is taken care of, is respected with our public policy decisions and in how we build community. And so that's what this campaign is about. And that's what I'm going to continue doing, you know, whatever the venue. And right now I'm pursuing it in the United States Senate because I think we need it. But I'm going to continue doing that no matter what, wherever I am. So, yeah. And I'm sure there are more lessons to be learned, in the coming weeks, months, and years to come.
Nick Albares, Democrat running for the United States Senate here in Louisiana. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Quentin. I really appreciate the conversation. This has been great.